This is a continuation of The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, comprising the second part of Chapter 2 and Chapters 3 and 4. Salz, Salz, bringe Salz, kein Peitsch, gnädige Herren, Salz, Salz, Salz. I turned, and there was Doc waltzing toward us with little tiny steps, bent over so low that the ends of his shawl touched the floor, his head crooked up sideways and looking through us. I knew then, but Eric translated softly. Salt, salt, I bring salt. No whip, merciful sirs. He is speaking to my countrymen in their language. Doc had spent his last months in a Nazi-operated salt mine. And it does not matter, sir, Bo translated, but directing his remark at Bruce. True, great civilizations have been dwarfed or broken by the Change War. But others, once crushed in the bud, have bloomed. In the 1870s, I traveled a Mississippi that had never known Grant's gunboats. I studied piano, languages, and the laws of chance under the greatest European masters at the University of Vicksburg. And you think your pipsqueak steamboat culture is compensation for— Bruce began, but— Prithee none of that, lad, Sid interrupted smartly. Nations are as equal as so many madmen or drunkards, and I'll drink dead drunk the man who disputes me. Hear reason. Nations are not so puny as to shrivel and vanish at the first tampering with their past, no, nor with the 10th. Nations are monsters, boy, with guts of iron and nerves of brass. Waste not your pity on them. True indeed, sir, Bo pressed, cooler and keener for the attack on his greater south. Most of us enter the change world with the false metaphysic that the slightest change in the past, a grain of dust misplaced, will transform the whole future. It is a long while before we accept with our minds, as well as our intellects, the law of the conservation of reality. That when the past is changed, the future changes barely enough to adjust, barely enough to admit the new data. The change winds meet maximum resistance always. Otherwise, the first operation in Babylonia would have wiped out New Orleans, Sheffield, Stuttgart, and Maud Davies' birthplace on Ganymede. Note how the gap left by Rome's collapse was filled by the imperialistic and Christianized Germans. Only an expert demon historian can tell the difference in most ages between the former Latin and the present Gothic Catholic Church. As you yourself, sir, said of Greece, it is as if an old melody were shifted into a slightly different key. In the wake of a big change, cultures and individuals are transposed, it's true. Yet in the main, they continue much as they were, except for the usual scattering of unfortunate but statistically meaningless accidents. All right, you bloody savants, maybe I pushed my point too far, Bruce growled. But if you want variety, give a thought to the rotten methods we use in our wonderful change war. Poisoning Churchill and Cleopatra, kidnapping Einstein when he's a baby. The snakes did it first, I reminded him. Yes, and we copied them. How resourceful does that make us? He retorted, arguing like a woman. If we need Einstein, why don't we resurrect him? Deal with him as a man. Bo said, serving his culture in slightly thicker slices. Pardonnez-moi, but when you have enjoyed your status as double-ganger a soupçon longer, you will understand that great men can rarely be resurrected. Their beings are too crystallized, sir. Their lifelines too tough. Pardon me, but I think that's rot. I believe that most great men refuse to make the bargain with the snakes, or with us spiders either. They scorn resurrection at the price demanded. Brother, they ain't that great, I whispered, while Bo glided on with, however that may be, you have accepted resurrection, sir, and so incurred an obligation which you as a gentleman must honor. Sid touched my wrist, and, as Bruce raved on, he whispered to me, what kind of ball, think you, will please and so quench this fire-brained rogue? And you love me, discover it. I whispered back without taking my eyes off Bruce either. I know somebody who'll be happy to put on any kind of ball he wants, if he'll just notice her. The new girl, sweetling? 'Tis well. This rogue speaks like an angry angel. It touches my heart and I like it not. Bruce was saying hoarsely but loudly. And so we're sent on operations in the past, and from each of those operations the change winds blow futurewards, swiftly or slowly, according to the opposition they breast, sometimes rippling into each other, and any one of those winds may shift the date of our own death ahead of the date of our resurrection. so that in an instant, even here, outside the cosmos, we may molder and rot or crumble to dust and vanish away. The wind with our name in it may leak through the door. Faces hardened at that, because it's bad form to mention change death, and Eric flared out with, "Halt small, camarade. There's always another resurrection." But Bruce didn't keep his mouth shut. He said, "Is there? I know the spiders promise it, but even if they do go back and cut another doubleganger from my lifeline, is he me?" He slapped his chest with his bare hand. "I don't think so. And even if he is me, with unbroken consciousness, why's he been resurrected again? Just to refight more wars and face more change death for the sake of an almighty power." His voice was rising to a climax. "An almighty power so bloody ineffectual, it can't furnish one poor soldier pulled out of the mud of Passchendaele, one miserable change commando, one godforsaken recuperee a proper issue of equipment." And he held out his bare right hand toward us, fingers spread a little, as if it were the most amazing object and most deserving of outraged sympathy in the whole world. The new girl's timing was perfect. She whisked through us, and before he could so much as wiggle the fingers, she whipped a black gauntleted glove on it, and anyone could see that it fitted his hand perfectly. This time, our laughing beat the other. We collapsed and slopped our drinks and pounded each other on the back and then started all over. "Ach, der Handschuh, Liebchen, where'd she get it?" Eric gasped in my ear. "Probably just turned the other one inside out. That turns a left into a right. I've done it myself," I wheezed, collapsing again at the idea. "That would put the lining outside," he objected. "Then I don't know," I said. "We got all sorts of junk in stores." "It doesn't matter, Liebchen," he assured me. "Ach, der Handschuh." All through it, Bruce just stood there admiring the glove, moving the fingers a little now and then, and the new girl stood watching him as if he were eating a cake she'd baked. When the hysteria quieted down, he looked up at her with a big smile. "What did you say your name was?" "Lily," she said. And believe you me, she was Lily to me even in my thoughts from then on, for the way she'd handled that lunatic. "Lillian Foster," she explained. "I'm English also. Mr. Marchant, I've read A Young Man's Fancy I don't know how many times." "You have? It's wretched stuff. From the Dark Ages. I mean my Cambridge days. In the trenches, I was working up some poems that were rather better." "I won't hear you say that. But I'd be terribly thrilled to hear the new ones. Oh, Mr. Marchant, it was so strange to hear you call it Passchendaele." "Why, if I may ask?" "Because that's the way I pronounce it to myself. But I looked it up and it's more like Passchendaele." "Bless you. All the Tommies called it Passchendaele, just as they called Ypres wipers." "How interesting. You know, Mr. Marchant, I'll wager we were recruited in the same operation. Summer of 1917. I'd got to France as a Red Cross nurse, but they found out my age and were going to send me back." "How old are you?" "Same thing, I mean to say." 17. 17 in 17, Bruce murmured, his blue eyes glassy. It was real corny dialogue, and I couldn't resent the humorous leer Eric gave me as we listened to them, as if to say, "Ain't it nice, Liebchen? Bruce has a silly little English schoolgirl to occupy him between operations?" Just the same, as I watched Lily in her dark bangs and pearl necklace and tight little gray dress that reached barely to her knees, and Bruce hulking over her tenderly in his snazzy hussar's rig, I knew that I was seeing the start of something that hadn't been part of me since Dave died fighting Franco years before I got on the big time. The sort of thing that almost made me wish there could be children in the change world. I wondered why I'd never thought of trying to work things so that Dave got resurrected, and I told myself, no, it's all changed. I've changed. Better the change winds don't disturb Dave or I know about it. "No, I didn't die in 1917. I was merely recruited then," Lily was telling Bruce. "I lived all through the 20s, as you can see from the way I dress. But let's not talk about that, shall we? Oh, Mr. Marchant, do you think you can possibly remember any of those poems you started in the trenches? I can't fancy them bettering your sonnet that concludes with, 'The bough swings in the wind, the night is deep. Look at the stars, poor little ape, and sleep.' That one almost made me whoop. What monkeys we are, I thought, though I'd be the first to admit that the best line to use on a poet is one of his own. In fact, as many as possible. I decided I could safely forget our little Britons and devote myself to Eric or whatever needed me. Chapter 3, 9 for a Party. Hell is the place for me, for to hell go the fine churchmen and the fine knights, killed in the tourney or in some grand war, the brave soldiers and the gallant gentlemen. With them will I go. There go also the fair gracious ladies who have lovers 2 or 3 beside their lord. There go the gold and the silver, the sables and ermine. There go the harpers and the minstrels and the kings of the earth. Aucassin. I exchanged my drink for a new one from another tray Beau was bringing around. The gray of the void was beginning to look real pleasant, like warm, thick mist with millions of tiny diamonds floating in it. Doc was sitting grandly at the bar with a steaming tumbler of tea. A chaser, I guess, since he was just putting down a shot glass. Sid was talking to Eric and laughing at the same time, and I said to myself it begins to feel like a party. But something's lacking. It wasn't anything to do with the major maintainer. Its telltale was glowing a steady red, like a nice little home fire, amid the tight cluster of dials that included all the controls, except the lonely and frightening introversion switch that was never touched. Then Maud's couch curtains winked out and there were she and the Roman sitting quietly side by side. He looked down at his shiny boots and the rest of his black duds like he was just waking up and couldn't believe it all. And he said, "Omnia mutantur, nocet mutamur in illis." And I raised my eyebrows at Beau, who was taking the tray back, and he did proud by old Vicksburg by translating, "All things change, and we change with them." Then Mark slowly looked around at us, and I can testify that a Roman smile is just as warm as any other nationality, and he finally said, "We are 9, the proper number for a party. The couches, too. It is good." Maud chuckled proudly, and Eric shouted, "Welcome back from the void, comrade." And then, because he's German and thinks all parties have to be noisy and satirically pompous, he jumped on a couch and announced, "Herren und Damen, permit me to introduce the noblest Roman of them all, Marcus Vipsius Niger, legate to Nero Claudius, called Germanicus in a former time stream, and who, in 763 AUC, correct, Mark? It means 10 AD, you meatheads, died bravely fighting the Parthians and the snakes in the Battle of Alexandria. Hoch, hoch, hoch." We all swung our glasses and cheered with him, and Sid yelled at Eric, "Keep your feet off the furniture, you unschooled rogue," and grinned and boomed at all 3 hussars, "Take your ease, recuperees." And Maud and Mark got their drinks, the Roman painting Beau by refusing Falernian wine in favor of scotch and soda, and right away everyone was talking a mile a minute. We had a lot to catch up on. There was the usual yak about the war. The snakes are laying minefields in the void. I don't believe it. How can you mine nothing? And the shortages. Bourbon, bobby pins, and the stabilitin that would have brought Mark out of it faster. And what had become of people? Marcia! Oh, she's not around anymore. She'd been caught in a change gale in green and stinking in 5 seconds, but I wasn't going to say that. And Mark had to be told about Bruce's glove, which convulsed us all over again. And the Roman remembered a legionary who had carried a gripe all the way to Octavius because he'd accidentally been issued the unbelievable luxury item sugar instead of the usual salt. And Eric asked Sid if he had any new ghost girls in stock, and Sid sucked his beard like the old goat he is. "Dost thou ask me, lusty Allemande? Nay, there are several great beauties, amongst them an Austrian countess from Strauss's Vienna, and if it were not for Sweetling here, I poked a finger in Eric's chest between 2 of the bright buttons with their tiny death's heads. "You, my little von Hohenwald, are a menace to us real girls. You have too much of a thing about the unawakened ghost kind." He called me his little demon and hugged me a bit too hard to prove it wasn't so. And then he suggested we show Bruce the art gallery. I thought this was a real brilliant idea, but when I tried to argue him out of it, he got stubborn. Bruce and Lily were willing to do anything anyone wanted them to, though not so willing to pay any attention while doing it. The saber cut was just a thin red line on his cheek. She'd washed away all the dried blood. The gallery gets you, though. It's a bunch of paintings and sculptures and especially odd knickknacks, all made by soldiers recuperating here, and a lot of them telling about the change war from the stuff they're made of. brass cartridges, flaked flint, bits of ancient pottery glued into futuristic shapes, mashed up Incan gold rebeaten by a Martian, whirls of beady lunan wire, a picture in tempera on a crinkle-cracked, thick round of quartz that had filled a starship porthole, a Sumerian inscription chiseled into a brick from an atomic oven. There are a lot of things in the gallery, and I can always find some I haven't ever seen before. It gets you, as I say, thinking about the guys that made them, and their thoughts, and the far times and places they came from, and sometimes, when I'm feeling low, I'll come and look at them so I'll feel still lower and get inspired to kick myself back into a good temper. It's the only history of the place there is, and it doesn't change a great deal, because the things in it and the feelings that went into them resist the change winds better than anything else. Right now, Eric's witty lecture was bouncing off the big ears I hide under my pageboy bob, and I was thinking how awful it is that for us that there's not only change, but change. You don't know from one minute to the next whether a mood or idea you've got is really new or just welling up into you because the past has been altered by the spiders or snakes. Change winds can blow not only death, but anything short of it, down to the featheriest fancy. They blow thousands of times faster than time moves, but no one can say how much faster or how far one of them will travel, or what damage it'll do, or how soon it'll damp out. The big time isn't the little time. And then, for the demons, there's the fear that our personality will just fade and someone else climb into the driver's seat and us not even know. Of course, we demons are supposed to be able to remember through change, and in spite of it. That's why we are demons and not ghosts like the other double-gangers, or merely zombies or unborn and nothing more. And as Bo truly said, there aren't any great men among us, and blamed few of the masses either. We're a rare sort of people, and that's why the spiders have to recruit us where they find us without caring about our previous knowledge and background. A foreign legion of time, a strange kind of folk, bright but always in the background, with built-in nostalgia and cynicism, as adaptable as Centaurian shape-changers, but with memories as long as a Lunan's 6 arms, a kind of change people, you might say, the cream of the damned. But sometimes I wonder if our memories are as good as we think they are, and if the whole past wasn't once entirely different from anything we remember, and we've forgotten that we forgot. As I say, the gallery gets you feeling real low, and so now I said to myself, "Back to your lousy little commandant, kid," and gave myself a stiff boot. Eric was holding up a green bowl with gold dolphins or spaceships on it and saying, "And, to my mind, this proves that Etruscan art is derived from Egyptian. Don't you agree, Bruce?" Bruce looked up, all smiles from Lily, and said, "What was that, dear chap?" Eric's forehead got dark as the door, and I was glad the hussars had parked their sabers along with their shakos. But before he could even get out a Jerry cuss word, Doc breezed up in that plateau state of drunkenness so like hypnotized sobriety, moving as if he were on a dolly, ghosted the bowl out of Eric's hand, said, "A beautiful specimen of middle systemic Venusian. When 8H finished it, he told me you couldn't look at it and not feel the waves of the northern Venusian shallows rippling around your hoofs. But it might look better inverted. I wonder. Who are you, young officer?" "Nichevo." And he carefully put the bowl back on its shelf and rolled on. It's a fact that Doc knows the art gallery better than any of us, really by heart, he being the oldest inhabitant, though he maybe picked a bad time to show off his knowledge. Eric was going to take out after him, but I said, "Nix, camarade, remember gloves and sugar." And he contented himself with complaining, "That Nichevo, it's so gloomy and hopeless. Ungeheuerlich. I tell you, Liebchen, they shouldn't have Russians working for the spiders, not even as entertainers." I grinned at him and squeezed his hand. "Not much entertainment in Doc these days, is there?" I agreed. He grinned back at me a shade sheepishly, and his face smoothed and his blue eyes looked sweet again for a second, and he said, "I shouldn't want to claw out at people that way, Greta, but at times I am just a jealous old man." Which is not entirely true, as he isn't a day over 33, although his hair is nearly white. Our lovers had drifted on a few steps until they were almost fading into the surgery screen. It was the last spot I would have picked for the formal preliminaries to a little British smooching. But Lily probably didn't share my prejudices, though I remembered she'd told me she'd served a brief hitch in an arachnoid field hospital before being transferred to the place. But she couldn't have had anything like the experience I'd had during my short and sour career as a spider nurse. when I'd acquired my best-hated nightmare and flopped completely, job-wise but on the floor too, at seeing a doctor flick a switch and a being, badly injured but human, turn into a long cluster of glistening strange fruit. Ugh, it always makes me want to toss my cookies and my buttons. And to think that dear old Daddy Anton wanted his Greta Chile to be a doctor. Well, I could see this wasn't getting me anywhere I wanted to go, and after all there was a party going on. Doc was babbling something at a great rate to Sid. I just hoped Doc wouldn't get inspired to go into his animal imitations, which sound pretty fierce, and once seriously offended some recuperating ETs. Maud was demonstrating to Mark a 23rd century two-step, and Bo sat down at the piano and improvised softly on her rhythm. As the deep thrumming relaxing notes hit us, Eric's face brightened and he dragged me over. Pleasantly soon I had my feet off the diamond rough floor, which we don't carpet because most of the ETs, the dear boys, like it hard, and I was shouldering back deep into the couch nearest the piano, with cushions all around me and a fresh drink in my hand, while my Nazi boyfriend was getting ready to discharge his Weltschmerz's song, which didn't alarm me too much, as his baritone is passable. Things felt real good, like the maintainer was just idling to keep the place in existence and moored to the cosmos, not exerting itself at all or at most taking an occasional lazy paddle stroke. At times the place's loneliness can be happy and comfortable. Then Bo raised an eyebrow at Eric, who nodded, and next thing they were launched into a song we all know, though I've never found out where it originally came from. This time it made me think of Lily, and I wondered why. And why it's a tradition at recuperation stations to call the new girl Lily, though in this case it happened to be her real name. Standing in the doorway just outside of space, winds of change blow round you but don't touch your face. You smile as you whisper tenderly, "Please cross to me, Recuperi. The operation's over. Come in and close the door." Chapter 4, SOS from Nowhere. De Belash, Fresca, Mrs. Camel, World. Beyond the circuit of the shuddering bear, in fractured atoms. Elliot. I realized the piano had deserted Eric and I cranked my head up and saw Bo, Maud, and Sid streaking for the control divan. The major maintainer was blinking emergency green and fast, but the code was plain enough for even me to recognize the spider distress call, and for a second, I felt just sick. Then Eric blew out his reserve breath in the middle of door, and I gave myself another of those helpful mental boots at the base of the spine, and we hurried after them toward the center of the place, along with Mark. The blinks faded as we got there, and Sid told us not to move because we were making shadows. He glued an eye to the telltale, and we held still as statues as he caressed the dials like he was making love. One sensitive hand flicked out past the introversion switch over to the minor maintainer, and right away the place was dark as your soul, and there was nothing for me but Eric's arm, and the knowledge that Sid was nursing a green light I couldn't even see, although my eyes had plenty time to accommodate. Then the green light finally came back very slowly, and I could see the dear reliable old face, the green gold beard making him look like a merman, and then the telltale flared bright, and Sid flicked on the place lights, and I leaned back. "That nails them, lads. Whoever and whenever they may be. Get ready for a pickup." Bo, who was closest, of course, looked at him sharply. Sid shrugged uneasily. Me seemed at first it was from our own globe 1,000 years before our Lord. But that indication flickered and faded like witchfire. As it is, the call comes from something smaller than the place, and certs adrift from the cosmos. Me seemed too at one point I knew the fist of the caller, an Antipodean atomicist named Benson Carter. But that likewise changed. Bo said, "We're not in the right phase of the cosmos place's rhythm for a pickup, are we, sir?" Sid answered, "Ordinarily not, boy." Bo continued, "I didn't think we had any pickups scheduled, or standby orders." Sid said, "We haven't." Mark's eyes glowed. He tapped Eric on the shoulder. "An Octavian denarius against 10 Reichsmarks. It is a snake trap." Eric's grin showed his teeth. "Make it first through the door next operation and I'm on." It didn't take that to tell me things were serious, or the thought that there's always a first time for bumping into something from really outside the cosmos. The snakes have broken our code more than once. Maud was quietly serving out weapons, and Doc was helping her. Only Bruce and Lily stood off. But they were watching. The telltale brightened. Sid reached toward the maintainer, saying, "All right, my hearties. Remember, through this doorway pass the fishiest finaglers in and out of the cosmos." The door appeared to the left and above where it should be and darkened much too fast. There was a gust of stale salt sea wind, if that makes sense, but no stepped-up change winds I could tell, and I had been bracing myself against them. The door got inky, and there was a flicker of gray fur whips, and a flash of copper flesh and gilt, and something dark, and a clump of hooves, and Eric was sighting a stun gun across his left forearm, and then the door had vanished like that, and a tentacled silvery Lunan and a Venusian satyr were coming straight toward us. The Lunan was hugging a pile of clothes and weapons. The satyr was helping a wasp-waisted woman carry a heavy-looking bronze chest. The woman was wearing a short skirt and high-collared bolero jacket of leather so dark brown it was almost black. She had a two-horn pet sofa hairdress, and she was boldly gilded here and there and wore sandals and copper anklets and wristlets, one of them a copper-plated collar, and from her wide copper belt hung a short-handled double-headed axe. She was dark-complexioned, and her forehead and chin receded, but the effect was anything but weak. She had a face like a beautiful arrowhead, and a familiar one, by golly. But before I could say, "Kabisha Labris," Maud shrilly beat me to it with, "It's KB with two friends. Break out a couple of ghost girls." And then I saw it really was Old Home Week because I recognized my Lunan boyfriend Ilhilihis. And in the midst of all the confusion, I got a nice kick out of knowing I was getting so I could tell the personality of one silver-furred muzzle from another. They reached the control divan, and Illy dumped his load and the others let down the chest. And KB staggered, but shook off the two ETs when they started to support her. And she looked daggers at Sid when he tried to do the same, although she's his sweet Keftian friend he'd mentioned to Bruce. She leaned straight-armed on the divan and took two gasping breaths so deep that the ridges of her spine showed through her brown-skinned waist, and then she threw up her head and commanded, "Wine!" While Bo was rushing it, Sid tried to take her hand again, saying, "Sweetling, I'd never heard you call before and knew not this pretty little fist." But she ripped out, "Save your comfort for the Lunan." And I looked and saw, hey Zeus, that one of Ilhilihis's 6 tentacles was lopped off halfway. That was for me, and going to him, I fast briefed myself. Remember, he only weighs 50 pounds for all he's 7 feet high. He doesn't like low sounds or to be grabbed. The 2 legs aren't tentacles and don't act the same. Uses them for long walks, tentacles for leaps. Uses tentacles for close vision too, and for manipulation, of course. Extended, they mean he's at ease. Retracted, on guard or nervous. Sharply retracted, disgusted. Greeting. Just then, one of them swept across my face like a sweet-smelling feather duster, and I said, "Illy, man, it's been a lot of sleeps," and brushed my fingers across his muzzle. It still took a little self-control not to hug him, and I did reach a little cluckingly for his lopped tentacle, but he wafted it away from me, and the little voice box belted to his side squeaked, "Naughty, naughty. Papa will fix his little old self. Greta girl, ever bandaged even a Terra octopus?" I had. An intelligent one from around 250 million AD, but I didn't tell him so. I stood and let him talk to the palm of my hand with one of his tentacles. I don't savvy feather talk, but it feels good, though I've often wondered who taught him English, and watched him use a couple others to whisk a sort of Lunan band-aid out of his pouch and cap his wound with it. Meanwhile, the satyr knelt over the bronze chest, which was decorated with little death's heads and crosses with hoops at the top, and swastikas, but looking much older than Nazi, and the satyr said to Sid, "Quick thinkin', Gov, when you saw the door comin' in high and softened up gravity under it, but could I have some hep now?" Sid touched the minor maintainer, and we all got very light, and my stomach did a flip-flop while the satyr piled on the chest the clothes and weapons that Illy had been carrying, and pranced off with it all, and carefully put it down at the end of the bar. I decided the satyr's English instructor must have been quite a character, too. Wish I'd met him, her, it. Sid thought to ask Illy if he wanted moon normal gravity in one sector. But my boy likes to mix, and being such a lightweight Earth normal gravity doesn't bother him. As he said to me once, "Would Jovian gravity bother a beetle, Greta girl?" I asked Illy about the satyr, and he squeaked that his name was 7C, and that he'd never met him before this operation. I knew the satyrs were from 1 billion years in the future, just as the loonies were from 1 billion in the past, and I thought, creased us. But it must have been a real big or emergency-like operation to have the spiders using those two for it, with 2 billion years between them. A time difference that gives you a feeling of awe for a second, you know. I started to ask Illy about it, but just then, Bo came scampering back from the bar with a big red and black earthenware goblet of wine. We try to keep a variety of drinking tools in stock so folks will feel more at home. KB grabbed it from him and drained most of it in one swallow and then smashed it on the floor. She does things like that, though Sid's tried to teach her better. Then she stared at what she was thinking about, until the whites showed all around her eyes and her lips pulled way back from her teeth, and she looked a lot less human than the two ETs, just like a fury. Only a time traveler knows how like the wild murals and engravings of them some of the ancients can look. My hair stood up at the screech she let out. She smashed a fist into the divan and cried, "Goddess! Must I see Crete destroyed, revived, and now destroyed again? It is too much for your servant." Personally, I thought she could stand anything. There was a rush of questions at what she said about Crete. I asked one of them, for the news certainly frightened me. But she shot up her arms straight for silence and took a deep breath and began. In the balance hung the battle. Rowing like black centipedes, the Dorian hulls bore down on our outnumbered ships. On the bright beach, masked by rocks, 7C and I stood by the needle gun, ready to give the black hulls silent wounds. Beside us was Ilhilihis, suited as a sea monster. But then I saw she wasn't altogether the Iron Babe, for her voice broke and she started to shake and to sob rackingly, although her face was still a mask of rage, and she threw up the wine. Sid stepped in and made her stop, which I think he'd been wanting to do all along. This concludes the second part of 7 total of The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.